supposed to be there, and my presentation should be on the screen right now. So, first of all, I want to thank you, Dan, for sitting this meeting, the colleagues, the organization, and of course the attendants that are very, very generous to hear our ongoing thoughts. My presentation is called Aesthetical Politics on Deleuze and Guattari, Notes on a Non-optimistic Vitalism. So this is the second one. I have just 9 slides that are going to help me to get through this. First of all, as an introduction, I have noticed that there is some kind of new reading area on Deleuze and Guattari, or maybe it's not that new, but I'm just arriving to it. And this new reading area is a lot more aggressive than usual in a really positive sense, which shows me that we're building a more trustful and friendly bond with them and their thought. And on the other side, is less afraid to facing relatively dark notions as nihilism, depression, melancholy, non and unbeing, death, posthumanism, and so on, and to take those as serious keys to engage research. I'm going to try to postulate suffering and cruelty as key notions to rethink politics, and therefore as fully political notions, of course leaning on Deleuze and Guattari's thought. Third notation, what I'm going to present is just a collection of notes, ongoing hypotheses. So please don't expect any conclusive or highly elaborated thoughts. I have to declare I'm not a philosopher either, so I come from social sciences, and I think that's important to note. Best scenario for me would be to get some feedback from you and to see how far am I from an interesting idea. I'm going to start by frame Deleuze and Guattari's ontology within an epistemological frame, and that frame can be called post-structuralism, and it involves not a war against structuralism, but a radicalization of it from inside. I understand post-structuralism epistemology as a new grammar, as a new syntax, as a new set of rules to think and to act on the world. Therefore, it's not about authors, books, or time periods, or schools, or nationalities, but instead of that, about perhaps gestures, wings, ways of see, ways of walk, ways of wonder. In that sense, post-structuralism is a paradigm that is still forming and is trying to get its own consistency. Maybe its first characteristic is that one, that is probably the first paradigm to recognize itself before getting completely formed, but that's not important here. I have worked on that in other works. What is important is the notion of desire as a vector of post-structuralism, and inside and following this notion of vector of desire, I think there are 2 main branches inside post-structuralism. The first one, which considers desire as a lack of a fault, and that branch I would like to call it, no offense, Lacanian, and the other one considers desire productive, constructive of pretty much all reality. Of course, Deleuze and Guattari, and of course Foucault are located in this second branch, but we can trace this branch back up to Tarde and start working with the space, spatiality, and temporality that this branch builds up. So, as a new grammar, this infinitesimal differences paradigm will imply to think the social, the political, and the philosophical issues all over again, or at least to widen a lot. But this is not just a matter of concepts or pure philosophy. This impacts directly on our way to experience the world and on our capabilities of transform it. That's why maybe is not very well accepted in the political and philosophical ghettos. In that point, I just take Drawers' presentation as background. Then, as Drawer already said, asking if in Deleuze and Guattari we can find a political theory is a very conflictive territory in sciences. But I strongly believe, and I could say I strongly feel, smell, and have the sensation that DNG are fundamentally political thinkers. They renovated ontology and metaphysics, and they turned that renovation into an enormous effort to shuffle and to turn around the basic terms used to analyze and to live politics. From my perspective, that explains the way Deleuze explains how he conceives their reading process, holding a big one from behind and giving him a diabolical creature. There's something they need to say, but that only can be said by other mouth but their own. It's like they are allergic to their own words, unsaid but vital words, and therefore they have to make those words to come out of another's mouth. There's something insufficient in the way the things are, and that's why some things are possible just getting through the impossible. The example about Bergson being used to explain cinema is one of the most beautiful I can recall. So if you concede me those first points, then I'm going to move forward a bit, saying that DNG feel at some point that they're running out of resources to complete their goal. That is, to name politics. Philosophy and politics are not going to be enough to say what they want to say. They want to say it because they see it, beyond or before the words. But very soon in their thought, it is clear that DNG smells something in arts that deeply attracts them when they try to confront politics. Anyway, it's very clear that then they are not trying to build some kind of philosophy of art, so we can discard that as a possible explanation of that move right from the very beginning. There must be another explanation for this constant flirting with arts. My own reading hypothesis links those permanent reapproachments to aesthetics, literature, theater, painting, cinema, you know them all, with that epistemological turn made by their own ontological move. The encounter, Deleuze Guattari, would also mean that the emergence of a radically new way of channeling whatever was needed and to getting whatever it takes. But what did DNG see in arts that helped them to unlock the knot I think they sensed beforehand since ever, regarding politics, of course? A very complex set of operations, functionalities, engagements. Inside the infinitesimal paradigm that they contributed to shape, they glimpsed a number of reorganization procedures, an assemblage and reassemblage that connect elements that are not called to be connected. They realized they had already drained out the political lexicon and find in arts some material they intend to transfer to this lack of vocab political field. The art references, naturally, are not examples, but ways this unsayable finds to be partially said, partially viewed by its own. These art references are presented, from my point of view, as operations of the unsayable itself. So I am going to take the concept of creation, or I take the concept of creation to help us to trace this field. They focus on theater, but not in theater in general, arto, bene, or special attractive, as well as in painting, but not painting in general. Instead, Bacon and Cézanne are two of the most important for them. Cinema again, but characters as Bresson are very important. Literature, there is Kafka, Beckett, etc. But what do they have in common, or what do the NG see about them? For sure, success, pleasure, or joy are not part of their creation procedures. Becoming is not a voluntary or satisfying operation. It does not follow a plan, and it can just not. Body without organs is not something we love, but something we aim despite ourselves. Getting through the creation is not a pleasing process, according to these ones. Instead of that, suffering, cruelty, pain, and other ideas of that such become part of the possibility of creation of a power. We can see here a glimpse of Spinozist dark reading. Those ideas, suffering, cruelty, pain, and others, are part of a real transformation. The artist, or at least this type of artist, faces the impossible, his or her own impotence, his or her own shame of being a cliché from the very beginning. His or her first task would be to break it down, to rip it off, and that will mean necessarily to destroy or resign a very important of what constitutes him or herself as an artist, as a human being. Creation then demands a simultaneous process of subjectivation and desubjectivation that I like to present as the subjective action, but neologisms. In A Thousand Plateaux, for example, DNG expressed it in the terms of becoming. Only being taken by a becoming, we finally are what we really are. Before that, we are just what we are being produced to be, not ourselves. The paradox, of course, is that of the self. The Antiripos, they present this idea, I think, talking about the production of the unconscious, getting to a place that only exists by the fact we're hitting it, but that doesn't pre-exist but emerges from our going there, and that once we arrived, it ceases to exist. There, in Watt's philosophy, they represent the issue by saying that it's not about quitting the will, but to embrace the will, to abandon the will itself. So what are all these tongue twisters about? First of all, I think it seems very clear that it's about a not easy task. Also, the experimentation is very far from any postmodern gestures that claim that there is all the same, you can try whatever you want. At the end of the day, any connections are equivalent. I think this is very, very far from that posture. Third, there is something related to the fact there are no formulas to follow, and nevertheless, we have an active and vital part on it. Finally, there's no guarantee. It's not about doing something creative from inside the system, but to twist the system to the limit in which it itself becomes something completely different. It's not about violating the rules, but to actively point at the fact there are not necessary rules. That's what the slide from off-centered systems to on-centered systems imply. And I know all of this seems to be a huge mess, but it can be other way, because I rather look at it as a surface made of paradoxes. And in that sense, there is no way trying to avoid or to solve the paradoxes. instead of that, is all about become able to inhabit that surface, becoming a paradox ourselves. DNG say that we should get in touch with the non-human forces that compose the whole thing to manipulate them and create something. But the only way to do it, it seems to me, it's to stop being humans, at least on part, to undo our own humanness, understanding it as a trimming operation of those forces, ergo, facing our own impotence. And what about the arts? Because we could think of this from the point of view of the concept of thinking. Creating concepts unveil and stop idiocy. Of course, by my reading hypothesis implies that when DNG talk about concept creation, they understand the creation process as an aesthetic one. That's why art becomes so important. And the bridge to complete transference is the notion of creation. In arts, they perceive some powerful procedures not related to the work of arts as a product or with the specificity of the art itself, but related to the way those characters, Artaud, Bacon, Bresson, Beckett, Kafka, relate to their raw material and the way in which they propose multiple relations to their raw material inside itself or within its own components. Affect, we know, is the name of the common raw material of arts, as they claim. So it's not about transfer all the life issues into affect material, but to become able to work the way the artists work with their material, but with our life material, to transfer that wink, that gesture. That's creation, and that's the moment it stops being art and becomes being aesthetics. From that point of view, we're talking about nothing but existence aesthetics, even if they never referred to that in those terms. Our field is not art, but existence itself, beyond life, beyond humanity. And whatever it is, its own raw material, our operation on it must be an aesthetic one. So what about life? We can agree in a wide notion of politics to answer that. And therefore, now we are forced to think politics aesthetically, but not as a metaphor. So the value of creation as a vector concept would be that it contains the clue to unravel the way DNG thinks politics. Bottom line, if aesthetics is the updated gesture to think and act politics nowadays, then aesthetics becomes ethics. Of course, the fatal consequences all of this is to remember that some characteristics of the creation act, it hurts, it must hurt, and it involves the destruction of ourselves, at least in part, so we won't be able to account for the process. There's no history of the creation, because as the event, it creates its own speciality and its own temporality. There's no way to adequate the work to a pre-existing code, but to approach the facts and get one with the facts code itself. And that requires to undo our own codes as we approach the fact. The thing is to undo our codes and to undo ourselves at the same time. And that's why this cannot be done as a willingness act, but through some kind of cruelty on ourselves, as Artaud shows. Once we merge with the raw material, we won't get out as ourselves, but radically others. The people to come is the redness in the eyes of those who saw and touched the forces, being and becoming him, herself, forces at the same time. That's creation, and whatever is created can only be said, seen, smelled afterwards, and under its own rules of speech, sight, and smell. Last paradox, this implies to get voluntarily in touch with the forces, with new forces. Therefore, suffering, cruelty, pain, death. But we're talking about the will to abandon the will, not the will to do things. From the will to be loved to the will to be able to love, as Deleuze once said. And of course, we're talking about the death as they read it in Blanchard, as the million little deaths that compose the life itself and without which life wouldn't be alive at all. Therefore, we're on front of a new reading of Conatus, a reading that implies a much more radical vitalism, a non-optimistic one. To increase our potency is not necessarily to be happy, but to finally become ourselves by getting rid of most of ourselves at the same time. Here, pain, suffering are keywords to creation at the level of existence, and if that's not politics, I don't know what it could be. Final slide. Summarizing, I would like to emphasize that this whole political thought unveils a deep Spinozist, non-optimistic vitalism that requires to conceive aesthetics as ethics. That's why I propose the neologism Est-ethics as a possible way to think the creation act becoming itself a contemporary political act. Of course, the distance between my reading hypothesis and the way neoliberalism seems to have captured all the potency of those notions close to DNG has to be established by the importance of this non-optimistic vitalism that implies a resignation to all ideal of success and the affirmation of the cruelty in the terms of Artaud and the suffering as political territories to dispute the life itself without guarantee and to consider that as the most powerful politics nowadays. I'm out of the theme, but I've finished.